I'm 35 years old and I just sat through the most degrading 2 hours of my life at some overpriced steakhouse downtown. My brother Tiago got promoted to regional manager at his company, and my parents threw him this massive celebration dinner. The whole family was there. Dad, Mom, Tiago, Uncle Randy, my aunt, a few cousins. 20 people watching me get torn apart like it was the evening's entertainment. Here's what you need to understand first. I've been the family disappointment since I was 22. I dropped out of college my senior year to work on a startup idea with some guys I met online. My parents lost their minds. Dad told me I was throwing my life away. Mom cried for weeks. Tiago, who was always the perfect son, had just graduated with honors and landed his first corporate job. The comparison started immediately and never stopped. Every family gathering for the past 13 years has been the same pattern. Tiago's accomplishments get celebrated. My life gets picked apart. They think I'm broke. They think I'm barely surviving. And I let them think that because watching them underestimate me has been the most useful thing I've ever done. The truth is, I'm worth about $8 million. That startup I dropped out for actually worked. We sold it 4 years ago, and I walked away with serious money. Since then, I've been investing, doing consulting work, living comfortably in a nice condo downtown. But I drive a 2015 Toyota Camry when I visit family. I dress in old jeans and regular shirts. I complain about rent prices and joke about eating ramen. They eat it up because it confirms everything they already believe about me. Why do this? Because I've been planning something for years now, and I needed them to have no idea what was coming. I needed them comfortable in their superiority. I needed them to keep treating me like garbage, so when I finally acted, there would be no question about whether I was justified. So back to the dinner. We're at this place with white tablecloths and a waiter who keeps refilling wine glasses. Tiago's sitting at the head of the table in a suit that probably cost $2,000, talking about his new responsibilities and salary bump. Everyone's congratulating him, toasting him, asking him questions about his career trajectory. Standard golden child worship session. I'm sitting at the far end picking at my steak and trying to be invisible. That's usually how these things go. Stay quiet, leave early, maintain the peace. But Dad had been drinking and he decided tonight was the night to really hammer home how disappointed he is in me. He stood up with his wine glass and started what I thought was going to be another toast to Tiago. Instead, he turned to me and announced to the entire table that he wanted to use Tiago as an example of what a real man looks like. Someone who finished college. Someone who worked his way up in a respectable company. Someone who owned a house and had retirement accounts and knew how to dress like an adult. Then he said, "Look at your brother. A real man with real money, not like you begging for gas money at 35. The table went silent for maybe 2 seconds. Then Mom laughed. That sharp, mean laugh she does when she's had too much wine and feels like being cruel. She added that at least they knew who not to call in emergencies. She brought up the mattress I'm supposedly sleeping on. The one I told them I got from Craigslist years ago as a throwaway comment. She said even homeless shelters have standards while looking right at me. Tiago grabbed my shoulder. I could feel his hand squeezing like he owned me. He leaned in and said he makes my annual salary in 2 months and asked how that feels. Called me a loser right there in front of everyone. Uncle Randy, who's always been Dad's echo chamber, decided to pile on and announced that my credit score was 420, and he knew because he checked somehow. The whole table laughed. Mom raised her glass and made a toast about knowing who not to call when things go wrong. Everyone cheered. Every single person at that table minus one cousin who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. They cheered my humiliation like it was a fun party game. I smiled, I nodded. I took a drink of my water and I smiled at every single one of them while my brain was calculating exactly how I was going to destroy them. See, here's what none of them know. 2.5 years ago, Dad called me in a panic. They were behind on their mortgage. Some investments had gone bad. They'd helped Tiago with his house down payment. Medical bills were piling up. They were 3 months behind and facing foreclosure on the house they'd lived in for 30 years. He didn't ask me for help because what could I possibly do? He was calling to vent, to complain about the unfairness of it all. I listened to him talk for an hour about how they might lose everything. Then I made some sympathetic noises and hung up. 3 days later, I had my lawyer set up an LLC and anonymously paid off their entire mortgage debt, $78,000. I bought out their loan through a private lending arrangement that made it look like a bank restructure. They thought they got lucky with some refinancing program. But I didn't stop there. Over the next 2 years, I've quietly paid for things. I covered Uncle Randy's property taxes twice when he was short. I anonymously paid Tiago's car loan for 6 months when he was between jobs last year, though he thinks his wife's parents helped. I set up a fund that's been covering Mom's medical premiums. Every single one of them has been living partially on my money, and they have no idea. The LLC is structured so that I own everything. the mortgage on their house, Randy's tax liens, financial arrangements I've made that they think are bank loans or refinancing or lucky breaks. I've been setting this up for 2 years, putting myself in a position where I control their financial stability, and they've been calling me a loser the entire time. So I sat there at dinner, smiled at their jokes, and decided that night was the last night they'd sleep comfortably in that house I bought for them. I left before dessert came, told them I had work early even though it was Saturday. Tiago made another joke about me having to work weekends at whatever dead-end job I was pretending to have. I smiled and walked out. First thing Monday morning, I called my lawyer, told him to send official notices to all of them. The anonymous benefactor arrangement was ending. The mortgage payments I'd been covering needed to start coming from them immediately. All the little financial safety nets I'd provided were being withdrawn. Every loan, every covered payment, every bit of help I'd given was going back to being their problem. My lawyer asked if I was sure. This was going to hurt them badly. Multiple properties at risk, legal complications, financial chaos. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. The notices went out Tuesday. They had 30 days to arrange payment on the full mortgage balance, to cover back taxes, to handle the loans they thought were manageable, everything coming due at once. Here's the thing, nobody at that dinner understood. I didn't become successful by accident. I didn't get lucky. I spent 13 years building something while they were mocking me, and I did it specifically so that one day I could watch them panic. Every business decision I made, every investment, every hour of work was building toward having enough power that they couldn't hurt me anymore. More than that, so I could hurt them back. I've been angry for 13 years. Not sad, not hurt, angry. Every family dinner where they compared me to Tiago, every comment about my life choices, every joke at my expense, I remembered all of it, and I've been waiting for the right moment. That dinner was the right moment. They crossed a line they'd been dancing around for years and did it publicly, happily, with everyone cheering. They made it clear exactly how they see me. So now they get to see exactly what I can do when I stop playing the role they assigned me. The paperwork is filed. The notices are sent. In about 2 weeks, they're going to realize what's happening. They're going to add up all the financial stability they thought they had and realize it was all me. That the failure son they've been mocking has been the only thing keeping them afloat. And when they figure it out, when they come to my door begging, I'm going to smile the same way I smiled at that dinner. I'm going to look at each of them and remember every word they said, every laugh, every joke, every time they made me feel small. Then I'm going to close the door in their faces. This is just the beginning. Update 1. It's been 12 days since I posted, and things are accelerating faster than I expected. For those who commented that I should prepare for them to retaliate or try to manipulate me back into helping, you were right. They're trying everything, and it's actually kind of fascinating to watch people who've spent over a decade calling me incompetent suddenly treat me like I'm a criminal mastermind. The first notice hit my parents' mailbox on Thursday. Dad called me that evening while I was at the gym. I let it go to voicemail. He sounded confused more than anything else. Said they got some weird letter about their mortgage and could I look at it because maybe it was a scam. Very casual, like he was asking me to check if an email was phishing. I didn't call back that night. I wanted them to sit with it for a while. Let the confusion turn into concern. Friday morning, Dad called again, this time earlier, around 7. I was having coffee and I picked up because I wanted to hear how he'd frame this conversation. He started with small talk, asked how work was going, made some comment about the weather. Then he circled back to this letter they got, and he was wondering if I knew anything about financial stuff because the language was confusing, and they were trying to figure out if it was legitimate. He said something about their mortgage being restructured a few years back, and now this company was claiming they owned the note and wanted full payment within 30 days. I asked him what company name was on the letter. He read it off. It was my LLC. I told him it sounded official and he should probably contact a lawyer. He went quiet for a few seconds and then asked why I thought they'd need a lawyer. I said because if someone's demanding $78,000 in 30 days, that seems like the kind of thing you'd want legal advice about. He started asking me more questions. Did I know anyone in real estate finance? Did I know how these mortgage companies worked? Could I maybe look into this for them because they were worried it might be some kind of fraud? The whole time he's talking to me like I'm useful for once. Like suddenly the disappointment son might have skills they need. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. I wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. I wanted the rest of them to get their notices first. I wanted everyone panicking before I showed them exactly who was behind it. Uncle Randy's property tax notice arrived Friday afternoon. He called Dad immediately, and they spent 2 hours on the phone trying to figure out if these were connected. Randy was convinced someone had stolen their identities and was running some elaborate scam. Dad agreed it seemed too convenient that they'd both get these letters in the same week. Tiago's car loan notice came Saturday. That one was interesting because Tiago actually is smart about money usually. He looked at the paperwork and within an hour he'd figured out that someone had been making his payments for the last 6 months, and now that entity was demanding immediate repayment of the full remaining balance plus administrative fees. He called Dad. Dad called Randy. The three of them had a conference call Saturday night where they tried to piece together what was happening. I know because Mom called me Sunday morning and told me all about it. She wanted to know if I'd gotten any weird financial letters because the whole family was getting them, and they were worried someone was targeting them. I asked her what kind of letters. She described the mortgage situation, Randy's property taxes, Tiago's car loan. She said they'd started going through old paperwork and realized a lot of things they thought were bank programs or refinancing deals were actually connected to this same LLC. She asked me directly if the name meant anything to me. I said no. I asked if they'd contacted the company. She said they'd tried, but it went to a law office that wouldn't give them any information without written requests. She sounded stressed in a way I'd never heard before. Not the wine-fueled meanness from the dinner. Actual fear. She told me they were having a family meeting at the house Monday evening and I should come. Everyone was going to be there to figure out what was happening and how to handle it. She said they needed to stick together as a family during this crisis. I told her I'd try to make it, but I had work commitments. She got frustrated and said this was more important than work, that they needed everyone there because this was serious. Then she said something that made me actually laugh out loud. She said maybe I should come because even though I wasn't good with money, sometimes having everyone's perspective helps. Even in crisis mode, she couldn't help herself. Had to throw in that little dig about me not being good with money while asking me to help them figure out their financial disaster. I told her I'd see what I could do and ended the call. Monday, I showed up at their house around 7. The whole family was there. Dad, Mom, Tiago and his wife Harper, Uncle Randy, my Aunt Paisley, the cousin who'd looked uncomfortable at the dinner. Everyone was in the living room with papers spread across the coffee table. They'd organized all the notices, highlighted sections, made notes. It looked like a war room. Dad saw me first and actually looked relieved. He thanked me for coming and said they really needed to figure this out together. Tiago barely looked at me. Randy was on his phone searching something. Mom brought me coffee without asking if I wanted any and sat me down on the couch like I was there to help them solve this mystery. Dad started explaining what they'd discovered. Multiple family members had received notices from the same LLC. All of them involved financial arrangements they'd thought were standard banking or refinancing situations. The common thread was that someone had been making payments or covering debts and now wanted everything back immediately. They'd calculated the total amount demanded across all the notices. It was close to $200,000. Randy said he'd done research and found that this kind of coordinated financial attack usually meant someone was targeting them specifically, either an enemy or someone running an elaborate extortion scheme. Harper suggested it might be related to Tiago's company, and someone was going after his family to get to him. Paisley thought maybe they'd all signed something years ago they'd forgotten about. Nobody had considered that it might be someone in the room. Dad asked if anyone had any idea who might do this to them. Everyone shook their heads. He said they needed to think about anyone they'd had conflicts with over the years. Business partners, neighbors, distant relatives. Anyone who might have the resources and motivation to set up something this complicated. I sat there drinking the coffee Mom had given me and listened to them theorize. It was surreal. They were so focused on external threats that they couldn't see the obvious. The person they'd been treating like garbage for 13 years was sitting right there with all the answers. Tiago finally looked at me and asked if I had any ideas. I shrugged and said it seemed like someone with serious money and planning skills. He asked if I knew anyone like that from my startup days. I said maybe, but most of those people had moved on to other things. The conversation went in circles for another hour. They kept coming back to the same problem. They didn't have $200,000. Even if they pooled everything, sold things, took out loans, they couldn't cover all of it. The 30-day deadline meant they couldn't even strategize properly. They were going to start losing properties, facing legal action, destroying their credit. Dad asked me if I could try to find out more information, maybe use my tech connections to figure out who owned this LLC. I told him I'd see what I could do. He looked so grateful, actually said thank you, and that he knew I'd come through for the family. I left around 10, told them I'd make some calls and see what I could find out. Mom hugged me at the door and said she was glad I was there to help, that even though things had been tense lately, family sticks together when it matters. I drove home and opened a bottle of wine, poured myself a glass and sat on my balcony overlooking the city, watched the lights and thought about every single thing they'd said to me over the years. Every joke, every comparison to Tiago. Every time they'd made it clear I was the family disappointment. Tuesday morning, my lawyer called. He'd received multiple requests for information about the LLC, all from different family members trying different angles. One claimed fraud, one threatened legal action, one tried to negotiate. He asked me how I wanted him to respond. I told him to respond to each one individually. Confirm the LLC exists. Confirm the debts are legitimate. Confirm the 30-day deadline. Offer no additional information about ownership or motivation. Keep it completely professional and give them nothing to work with. He asked me again if I was sure about this. These were my parents, my brother, extended family. Was I really prepared to follow through with property liens and legal action against them? I told him yes. I told him I'd spent 13 years being their punching bag and I was done. They wanted to know who I really was? They were about to find out. Wednesday evening, Dad called me. He'd been to see a lawyer himself, and the lawyer had confirmed everything was legitimate. They were actually in danger of losing the house. He asked me if I'd found out anything about the LLC ownership. I told him not yet, but I was working on it. His voice changed then, got harder. He said they'd been talking as a family and something wasn't adding up. The timing of all this. The fact that it hit right after Tiago's dinner. The way the LLC had been involved in their finances for years without them knowing. He said it felt personal. I didn't say anything, just listened. He asked me point blank if I knew more than I was saying. I asked him why he'd think that. He said because I was being too calm about all this, too helpful. And the lawyer had mentioned that LLCs like this were often used by individuals for liability protection. He wanted to know if I was connected to this somehow. I laughed. I actually laughed and asked him if he seriously thought I had the money or connections to set up something like this. The disappointment son, who begs for gas money? The loser sleeping on a Craigslist mattress? How would I even begin to manage something this sophisticated? He went quiet. Then he said something that made me realize he was starting to put pieces together. He said they'd been going through old financial records, and a lot of the payments that had saved them over the years had started right around the time I'd supposedly been struggling most, right after my startup supposedly failed. He was wondering if maybe things weren't exactly what I'd told them. I asked him what he meant. He said he wanted to know where I actually lived, what I actually did for money, why I drove that beat-up car and wore old clothes when maybe I didn't have to. He said he needed the truth from me about what my life really looked like. I told him I'd think about when I wanted to have that conversation. Then I hung up. They're starting to figure it out. Not all the way yet, but they're close. And I can tell the panic is setting in because Thursday morning I woke up to 17 missed calls and 32 text messages from various family members, all saying basically the same thing. They need to talk to me. They need answers. They need help. The deadline is in 18 days. The pressure is building exactly how I planned it. And I'm not answering any of them because I want them to really understand what it feels like when the person you've been counting on suddenly isn't there, just like they made me feel for 13 years. Update 2. It's been 21 days since that dinner and 13 days left until the deadline. I need to write this out because the last 4 days have been absolutely insane, and I'm still processing how it all went down. For everyone who said my family would show up at my door once they figured it out, you called it perfectly. Friday afternoon, I was working from my home office when my building's doorman called up. He said I had visitors in the lobby, multiple people claiming to be family. He sounded uncertain because I'd never had family visit before, and suddenly there were 5 people demanding to come up. I told him to send them up because I knew this confrontation was coming, and honestly, I'd been waiting for it. 2 minutes later, there's pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding. I opened it, and there's Dad, Mom, Tiago, Harper, and Uncle Randy all standing in my hallway looking like they'd just discovered I'd been living a double life, which I guess I had been. Mom's face was the best part. She walked in and just stood there staring at my place. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown, the furniture that didn't come from thrift stores, the actual artwork on the walls, the kitchen with appliances that cost more than her car. She kept looking around like she was in the wrong apartment. Dad walked straight to my living room and sat down without being invited. Told everyone else to sit too like this was his house. Tiago was looking at everything with this expression I couldn't quite read. Anger mixed with confusion mixed with something else. Randy went straight to my windows and stood there looking out at the view. Harper was the only one who seemed uncomfortable about barging in like this. She stayed near the door and kept glancing at me like she was apologizing without words. Dad started talking first. Said they'd hired a private investigator. Cost them $2,000 they didn't have, but they needed answers. The investigator traced the LLC back to me within 3 days. Found my real address, my real financial situation, confirmed I owned the entity that had been managing their debts. He said they'd spent the last 24 hours trying to process this information before deciding to confront me directly. I asked them if they wanted coffee. Mom made this sound like I'd slapped her. She wanted to know how I could offer them coffee like this was a social visit when I was actively trying to destroy their lives. I told her I was being polite since they'd barged into my home unannounced. Tiago cut in. He wanted to know if it was true, if I actually owned the LLC, if I'd really been the one paying their mortgage and covering their debts for 2 years. I confirmed it was all true. Every payment, every covered bill, every financial lifeline they'd gotten had come from me. The room went silent for maybe 10 seconds. Then Randy asked why. Why would I do this? Why set them up like this just to pull it all away? I laughed. I actually laughed and asked him if he was serious. Did he really not understand why? After 13 years of being treated like the family embarrassment? After being mocked at every gathering? After that dinner 3 weeks ago where they publicly humiliated me in front of 20 people? Dad said that was just family teasing. That's what families do. They joke around and sometimes it goes too far, but you don't destroy people's lives over some hurt feelings. He said I was being vindictive and cruel, and this wasn't who he raised me to be. I told him he didn't raise me to be anything because he checked out on me the moment I dropped out of college. I asked him if he remembered what he said to me when I told him about the startup. He looked confused. I reminded him he said I was throwing away my future on a fantasy and he was ashamed to tell people what I was doing with my life. That was 15 years ago and he'd maintained that position ever since. Mom jumped in. She said they'd been disappointed because they wanted better for me. They wanted me to have stability and security. Watching me struggle had been painful for them. All the comments and jokes were just their way of trying to motivate me to do better. I asked her if calling me a loser in front of the entire family was motivation, if comparing me to Tiago constantly was meant to inspire me, if mocking my living situation and credit score was their version of tough love. She said I was twisting things, that I'd always been sensitive and took things too personally. They'd never meant any of it maliciously. It was just family dynamics and every family has their jokes and their roles. Tiago finally spoke up. He said he wanted to understand the timeline. When did the startup actually succeed? When did I get money? How long had I been lying to them about my situation? I told him the company sold 4 years ago. I walked away with $8 million after taxes. I'd been investing and consulting since then, and my current net worth was around $12 million. I'd been pretending to struggle for their entire benefit because I knew the moment they found out I had money, they'd either want something from me or find new ways to diminish my success. He asked why I helped them financially if I hated them so much. Why pay off their mortgage? Why cover Randy's property taxes? Why help him with his car loan? I told him it was an investment in this exact moment. I needed leverage. I needed to put myself in a position where I controlled their financial stability, so when I decided I was done being their punching bag, I could do something about it. I spent 2 years building the foundation for this. Dad stood up. He was angry now, said I'd manipulated them, that I'd let them believe they were safe and stable, while secretly holding their lives hostage, that this was worse than anything they'd ever done to me. He called me calculating and said I'd become someone he didn't recognize. I told him he'd never known who I was to begin with. He'd decided when I was 22 that I was a failure, and he'd never updated that assessment. Every success I had after that point didn't matter because he'd already made up his mind about who I was. Randy said I was proving their point, that I was being spiteful and immature, that a real man would have confronted them directly instead of setting up this elaborate revenge scheme. He said the credit score thing was just a joke and I was overreacting to everything. I asked him how he'd actually checked my credit score since that's not something you can just do without someone's information and permission. He went quiet. Then he admitted he'd lied. He just threw out a random low number because he thought it was funny and everyone else was piling on. He said it was just a dinner joke and I needed to get over it. Mom started crying. Not real crying. That performative crying she does when she wants sympathy. She said they'd come here hoping I'd understand how desperate they were, that they could lose everything. The house they'd raised us in, their security, their retirement. She asked how I could do this to my own mother. I told her she'd made it clear at that dinner that she knew who not to call in an emergency, that she'd toasted to my uselessness in front of everyone. So I was just respecting her wishes and making sure she never had to depend on me for anything. Tiago tried a different approach. He said the dinner had gotten out of hand, that they'd all had too much to drink and things were said that shouldn't have been said. He admitted he'd been showing off and it was wrong to put me down to make himself look better. He said if I called off the LLC demands, they could start fresh. They could work on rebuilding the family relationships and treating me with more respect. I asked him if he remembered grabbing my shoulder, if he remembered telling me he made my annual salary in 2 months and calling me a loser. He said yes, and he apologized. Said he'd been caught up in the moment and the attention. But that didn't mean I should destroy the whole family over it. I told him I wasn't destroying anything. I was just stopping my financial support. The fact that they'd collapse without it wasn't my responsibility. They were all adults with jobs and lives. They should be able to handle their own finances without the failure son propping them up. Dad said this was different. They'd made decisions based on their financial situation. They'd taken on the house payments thinking they could manage it. They'd structured their lives around stability that I'd artificially created. Pulling it away now wasn't fair. I pointed out that I'd given them 30 days notice. That was more warning than they'd given me before publicly humiliating me. I'd also covered their debts for 2 years with no expectation of repayment. Now I wanted it back and they had time to figure it out. Harper finally spoke. She'd been quiet this whole time just watching everything unfold. She said she understood I was hurt and angry, but Tiago had a mortgage and 2 kids to think about. That whatever happened between me and the family, her children didn't deserve to suffer because their grandfather couldn't keep his mouth shut at dinner. I told her the kids would be fine. Tiago had a good job. They'd figure it out like millions of other families do. They just wouldn't have me secretly subsidizing their lifestyle anymore. Mom stopped crying. Suddenly, her voice got hard. She said I'd always been vindictive even as a child, that when things didn't go my way, I'd hold grudges and punish people. She said this was exactly the kind of thing she'd worried about when I was younger, and it's why they'd been so hard on me. They'd been trying to teach me that you don't get to throw tantrums when your feelings are hurt. I asked her if that was really how she saw this, me throwing a tantrum. She said yes, that I was a 35-year-old man acting like a teenager who got grounded, that I needed to grow up and accept that families argue and say mean things sometimes and you move past it. Randy said they'd all apologize if that's what I needed. They'd admit the dinner went too far. They'd work on treating me better going forward. But I needed to call my lawyer and cancel the debt collections. That this had gone far enough and it was time to be reasonable. I told them no. I wasn't interested in apologies or promises to do better. I'd heard all of that before over the years. Brief moments of guilt followed by more of the same treatment. I was done with the cycle. Tiago asked what I wanted then. If not apologies, if not changed behavior, what would make me stop this? I told him nothing. The deadline stood. They had 13 days to come up with the money or face the legal consequences. Dad said I'd regret this. That family was everything, and once I destroyed these relationships, I couldn't get them back. That I'd end up alone and miserable, and I'd realize too late that I'd thrown away the people who actually cared about me. I told him I'd already been alone. I'd been alone at every family gathering where I was the joke. Alone when they celebrated Tiago's achievements while ignoring mine. Alone when they made it clear I was the disappointment they had to tolerate. The only difference now was I wouldn't have to pretend we were a functional family. Mom said she'd never forgive me for this. That if I went through with it, she'd consider me dead to her. No mother should have to watch her child destroy her life out of spite. She said she'd tell everyone what kind of person I really was. That the whole family would know I'd set them up and betrayed them. I told her to go ahead. Tell everyone. Explain to them how the failure son secretly paid off their mortgage and kept them from losing their house. Explain how the loser they mocked was the only thing keeping their financial lives from falling apart. I was sure that would make me look like the villain. They left about 20 minutes later. Tiago was the last one out. He stood in my doorway and said he'd really thought we were closer than this. That despite everything, we were brothers and that should mean something. I told him brotherhood works both ways, and he'd made his priorities clear when he chose to humiliate me for a laugh. The apartment was quiet after they left. I poured myself a drink and sat on my couch looking at the city. Part of me had expected to feel something, guilt maybe, doubt about whether I was doing the right thing, but I just felt calm. Vindicated even. They'd confirmed everything I'd thought about them. Even confronted with the truth, even desperate and panicking, they couldn't actually take responsibility. It was all jokes gone too far, me being too sensitive, them trying to help in their own way. Saturday morning, Mom sent a long text. She'd been up all night thinking about what I'd said. She wanted me to understand their perspective. When I dropped out of college, they'd been terrified for me. They'd spent my whole childhood making sure I had opportunities, and watching me throw away my education had broken something in them. Every comment about my life since then had come from a place of fear and disappointment, not cruelty. She said she was sorry if I'd interpreted it as malicious, but their intentions had always been to push me toward a better life. I didn't respond. Sunday afternoon, Tiago called, left a voicemail saying Harper was upset, and the kids kept asking why everyone was fighting. He said he'd take full responsibility for what happened at the dinner. He'd tell the family it was all his fault. He'd make it right with everyone if I'd just reconsider the deadline. His voice cracked at the end, and he said he was scared he'd lose his house. I didn't call back. Monday morning, Dad sent an email. Said they'd been to see multiple lawyers and financial advisors. Everyone told them the same thing. The debts were legitimate, the deadlines were legal, and they had no recourse. They'd tried to get emergency loans, but their credit was already struggling from missed payments over the years. No bank would give them enough to cover $200,000 with no notice. He said they were going to lose everything, and he wanted me to know that. He wanted me to understand the real-world consequences of what I was doing. That this wasn't abstract. This was their home, their security, their futures. He said I had the power to stop it, and if I chose not to, I'd have to live with knowing I'd destroyed my own family. I archived the email. The deadline is in 9 days. They're getting desperate and trying every angle they can think of. Manipulation, guilt, anger, appeals to family loyalty. None of it is working because I spent 13 years watching them do this to me and I know all their tactics. Someone in the comments last time said they'd show up crying and begging. That hasn't happened yet, but I think it's coming. They're still in the anger and bargaining phase. The actual begging will come when they run out of time and options. I'm ready for it. I've been ready for this for years. Final update. It's been 33 days since that dinner. The deadline passed 3 days ago, and everything I set in motion is happening exactly as I planned. I'm writing this from my apartment at 6 in the morning after not sleeping because last night was the culmination of 2 years of preparation and 13 years of anger. Let me catch you up on what happened between my last update and now. The final 9 days before the deadline were a masterclass in watching people unravel when they realize they're truly powerless. My family tried everything, and I mean everything, to change my mind. Week 3, Dad showed up at my building 4 times. The doorman started recognizing him and looking uncomfortable when he had to call up to ask if I wanted visitors. I said no every time. Dad would wait in the lobby for hours, like somehow his presence would wear me down. On the 4th visit, the building manager had to ask him to leave because he was harassing other residents trying to get them to convince me to talk to him. Mom tried a different strategy. She started sending me things. A box of old photos from when Tiago and I were kids. A letter she'd written about her childhood and how hard her parents had been on her and how she'd promised herself she'd be different with her own children. A recording of herself crying and apologizing for every mean thing she'd ever said. Every package went straight into my storage closet unopened after the first one. Tiago called my work number somehow, got transferred to my direct line and tried to have a conversation about childhood memories and brotherhood. Talked about the time I'd helped him with a school project when we were teenagers, the time I'd covered for him when he snuck out to see a girl. He was trying to remind me of a relationship that supposedly existed beneath all the cruelty. I listened for about 3 minutes and then told him I had a meeting and hung up. Uncle Randy sent threatening messages. Said I'd be sorry when this was over, that I was making enemies I couldn't afford to have. That family has long memories and this kind of betrayal doesn't get forgotten. I forwarded all of them to my lawyer, who added them to the file in case we needed evidence of harassment. Harper sent a message through Instagram. Her account was private, but she found my professional profile somehow. The message was long and detailed about how Tiago had been having panic attacks, how he'd stopped sleeping, how their kids kept asking why Daddy was so upset all the time. She said she'd never done anything to me and didn't deserve to watch her family fall apart because of a dinner she wasn't even at. I read it twice and then archived it. The cousin who'd looked uncomfortable at the dinner reached out too. She apologized for not speaking up that night, said she'd felt awful watching it happen but didn't know how to intervene without making it worse. She asked if there was anything she could do to help resolve this situation. I told her she could stay out of it because this wasn't her fight. 5 days before the deadline, my lawyer called with an update. My parents had tried to file a lawsuit claiming fraud and financial manipulation. Their lawyer had explained the case was nonsense and refused to file it. They'd found another lawyer who did file it. My lawyer said the judge would dismiss it immediately because all the paperwork was legitimate and I'd broken no laws. He asked if I wanted to countersue for legal fees. I said no. I wanted them to waste their money on futile legal attempts. 3 days before the deadline, I got a call from someone claiming to be from Adult Protective Services. They'd received a report that I was financially exploiting elderly family members. I explained the situation calmly, provided documentation showing my parents were in their early 60s and fully capable, showed that I'd been helping them financially and was now simply ending that help with proper legal notice. The caseworker apologized for bothering me and closed the report. Later, I found out Mom had filed it, hoping it would somehow force me to back down. 2 days before the deadline, Tiago showed up at my gym. I'm not sure how he found out where I work out, but he was waiting outside when I came out after my session. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He wanted to talk. I told him we had nothing to discuss. He started crying right there on the sidewalk, said he'd made a mistake at the dinner, and he'd spent every day since then regretting it. That he'd been showing off and being cruel because some part of him had always been jealous of me. Jealous that I'd had the courage to chase something risky while he'd played it safe. That watching me succeed in my own way made him feel like his corporate ladder climbing was hollow. I asked him if that confession was supposed to make me feel bad for him. He said no. He just needed me to understand he hadn't meant any of it, that he actually admired me and always had. I told him he had a funny way of showing admiration by calling me a loser in front of our entire family. He said he knew, and he was sorry, and he'd spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I'd just give him a chance. I walked away. He followed me for half a block, still talking, until I turned around and told him if he didn't stop, I'd file a restraining order. He stopped walking, but I could hear him crying as I got in my car. The day before the deadline, my lawyer sent the final notices, 24 hours until legal proceedings began. Foreclosure on my parents' house, seizure of property for Uncle Randy's tax liens, repossession of Tiago's vehicle, and potential foreclosure on his house, depending on his payment status. Everything I'd set up was about to execute. That evening, I got 47 calls from various family members. I didn't answer any of them. I turned off my phone and went to bed early because I knew what was coming. At 4:17 a.m., my building intercom started buzzing, constant buzzing like someone was just holding down the button. I was already awake. I'd been lying in bed waiting because I knew they'd make one last desperate attempt. I went to my intercom panel and heard the doorman apologizing but saying he couldn't stop them from buzzing. There were multiple people in the lobby refusing to leave. I told him it was fine and to send them up. I wanted this final confrontation to happen on my terms in my space. The pounding on my door started immediately. I let them pound for a full minute before I opened it. All of them were there. Dad, Mom, Tiago, Harper, Uncle Randy, Aunt Paisley. 6 people in various states of distress at 4 in the morning in my hallway. Dad's eyes were red. Mom's makeup was smeared. Tiago looked like he'd been physically ill. Harper was trying to hold it together, but her hands were shaking. Randy looked angry, even in his desperation. Paisley looked confused, like she wasn't sure why she was there. Mom pushed forward first, started talking immediately about how this was it. This was the last chance. In a few hours, they'd lose everything, and I was the only person who could stop it. She said she was begging me. She got down on her knees right there in my hallway, actually on her knees with her hands clasped together. She said she'd give me anything I wanted. Money, apologies, years of making it up to me. Anything. Just please don't let them take the house. Dad wasn't kneeling, but his voice was broken. He said they'd screamed at me, they'd insulted me, they'd made terrible mistakes, but they were still my family. That blood meant something. That you don't destroy your own blood no matter what they've done. He said I could be angry forever, but this was permanent and couldn't be undone. In a few hours, the foreclosure process started and their lives would never recover. Tiago just kept saying he was sorry over and over, that he'd been wrong about everything, that I was the successful one, the smart one, the one who'd actually done something meaningful with my life, that he'd been projecting his own insecurity and I didn't deserve any of it. He said his kids would lose their home because of his mistakes, and he couldn't live with that. Harper was crying silently, holding onto Tiago's arm and crying. She didn't say anything to me directly, but she was clearly there as some kind of emotional leverage. Look at what you're doing to this woman who never hurt you. Randy was the only one who couldn't fully commit to begging. He started with apologies, but then shifted to saying this was cruel, that I was being vindictive and cruel and proving I was exactly what they'd always thought I was. That a real man would have confronted them directly instead of this elaborate revenge scheme. Dad shut him up fast and told him to stop talking because he was making it worse. Paisley asked what they'd done that was so bad it deserved this. She said she'd been at the dinner, and yes, things had gotten mean, but it was one night, one bad night. People have bad nights all the time and they move past it. This punishment didn't fit the crime. I let them all talk. I stood in my doorway and listened to every word they said, every apology, every justification, every desperate plea. I let them finish completely before I said anything. Then I asked them if they remembered the dinner. They all said yes, of course they remembered. I asked them to tell me what they remembered about it specifically, what had been said, what had happened. Dad started talking about how it was Tiago's celebration and things had gotten out of hand, that they'd been drinking and the jokes had gone too far. Mom agreed it had been inappropriate. Tiago said he'd been showing off and had gotten carried away with the attention. I stopped them. I told them that wasn't what I was asking. I wanted them to tell me the specific things they'd said to me, the exact words, quote them back to me. Nobody could do it. They remembered it had been mean. They remembered I'd been upset, but none of them could actually repeat what they'd said. The words that had been so easy to say 3 weeks ago suddenly couldn't be spoken. So I quoted them. I told Dad exactly what he'd said about me begging for gas money at 35. I told Mom about her toast to knowing who not to call in emergencies. I reminded Tiago about grabbing my shoulder and telling me he made my annual salary in 2 months. I brought up Randy's fake credit score announcement. I made them hear their own words reflected back at them. Mom started crying harder. She said she didn't remember saying it exactly like that she'd been drunk and angry about something else and had taken it out on me. Dad said the words sounded worse when repeated like this. That context mattered, and I was stripping away all the context. I asked them what context made any of that okay. What context justified publicly humiliating me at a family dinner? They didn't have an answer. Tiago said they'd all apologized multiple times, that they'd acknowledged they were wrong. What more did I want from them? How many apologies were enough? I told them I didn't want apologies. I wanted consequences. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be powerless while people who were supposed to care about you treated you like garbage. For 13 years, they'd made me feel small and useless and like a family embarrassment. Now they got to feel what I felt every single day. Dad said this was different, that financial ruin was permanent, that losing their house meant losing their retirement, their security, everything they'd built, that it wasn't comparable to hurt feelings. I told him my entire adult identity in this family had been based on their assessment of me as a failure, that every relationship, every interaction, every family event had been colored by their conviction that I was the disappointment. That wasn't just hurt feelings. That was 13 years of systematic degradation that I'd had to smile through while pretending everything was fine. Randy said I'd lied to them, though, that I'd pretended to be struggling when I was actually successful, that I'd deceived them for years while setting up this trap. How was that any better than what they'd done? I told him I'd lied because telling them the truth would have changed nothing. They'd have found new reasons to dismiss me or claimed my success was luck or found ways to make it about Tiago still being better. The lie had been self-preservation while I built something they couldn't touch. The trap had been justice. Harper finally spoke directly to me. She said she understood I was hurt and angry, that I had every right to be both. But her children were innocent. They'd done nothing wrong. They shouldn't lose their home because their uncle was settling scores with their grandfather. I told her she was right. The kids were innocent. But so was I when I was 22 and dropping out of college, and my family decided I was worthless because of it. So was I every year after that when they reinforced that message constantly. Innocence doesn't protect you from other people's cruelty. Her kids would learn that lesson early. Mom was fully sobbing now. She said she'd been a terrible mother, that she'd failed me in ways she couldn't articulate, that she'd spend the rest of her life trying to make it up to me if I'd just give her the chance. She said she was begging me, as the woman who gave birth to me and raised me, to please not do this. I looked at her kneeling in my hallway with mascara running down her face, and I felt nothing. No pity, no guilt, just cold satisfaction that she was finally understanding what powerlessness felt like. I told them all the deadline had passed at midnight. We were past the point of negotiation. The legal processes had begun. In a few hours, the foreclosure notice would be posted on my parents' house. Randy's property seizure was already scheduled. Tiago's car would be repossessed by end of week, and his mortgage was in default status. Dad asked if there was truly nothing they could do. No way to fix this. I told him they could pay the debts. All $200,000 of it. If they came up with that amount in the next 72 hours, everything would be canceled. He said they didn't have that kind of money. I knew they didn't have it. That was impossible, and I knew it. I told him then they'd face the consequences of not having it. Tiago asked what I wanted from them beyond the money. What would actually satisfy me? If they couldn't pay, what else could they do? I told him nothing. There was nothing they could do. This wasn't about getting something from them anymore. This was about them experiencing real consequences for the first time in their lives. They'd spent over a decade making me feel worthless, and now they got to be actually worthless in a tangible financial sense. Randy lunged forward. Paisley grabbed him and held him back. He was yelling about how I was destroying the whole family over pride, that I was no better than them, that I was worse actually because I'd premeditated all of this, that I was vindictive and cruel, and he'd been right about me all along. I told him he'd never been right about me. None of them had. They'd decided I was a failure and then spent 13 years treating me like one regardless of reality. The only thing they'd been right about was that I was patient. I'd waited a long time for this moment, and it was worth every year. I stepped back into my apartment and told them they needed to leave. They'd said everything they came to say, and I'd given them my answer. The legal processes were moving forward. Nothing was going to change that. Mom was still on her knees. She couldn't seem to get up. She kept saying please over and over. Just the word please, on repeat like a broken prayer. Dad tried to help her up, but she wouldn't move. She stayed there on her knees in my hallway saying please while I closed the door. I could hear them outside for another 10 minutes, talking among themselves. Someone crying. Randy's angry voice. Eventually, they left. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay there thinking about that dinner. About Dad standing up to use me as a cautionary tale. About Mom's mean laugh. About Tiago's hand on my shoulder squeezing like he owned me. About everyone cheering like my humiliation was entertainment. Then, I thought about them in my hallway at 4 in the morning. Desperate, begging, powerless. exactly where I'd planned for them to be. At 9 a.m., my lawyer called. The foreclosure posting was up. My parents had until end of business day to vacate or contest. Randy's property had a seizure notice. Tiago's car had been flagged for repossession. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. He asked me one more time if I wanted to stop it, if I wanted to restructure the debts or work out payment plans, give them some kind of option that didn't result in total financial destruction. I told him no. Let it all proceed. I'd spent 2 years setting this up and 13 years earning the right to do it. They'd made their choices and now they'd live with the consequences. It's been 3 days since the deadline passed. My parents moved out of their house yesterday. They're staying with Paisley, who has a small apartment and can barely fit them. Randy's property is in legal proceedings. Tiago's car was repossessed this morning. I know all of this because my cousin, the one who apologized, has been sending me updates even though I didn't ask for them. She thinks I should know what's happening, that seeing the real damage might change my mind. It hasn't changed anything. This is exactly what I wanted to happen. They humiliated me publicly and now they're experiencing public humiliation themselves. They made me feel small and powerless, and now they're actually powerless in ways that matter. I got one more message from Dad late last night. It just said that he'd never forgive me for this, that I'd destroyed the family, and he hoped I could live with that he'd rather be homeless than ever speak to me again. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He'd finally said something honest for the first time in 13 years. He'd rather be homeless than admit he was wrong. He'd rather lose everything than take actual responsibility for how he'd treated me. That message confirmed everything I'd believed about them. Someone asked in the comments of my first post if I'd feel guilty when this was over, if watching them suffer would make me regret it. I thought about that question a lot over the last few days. I've watched my parents lose their home. I've watched Tiago fall apart. I've seen the real-world consequences of what I set in motion, and I feel nothing but satisfaction. They humiliated me in front of 20 people, and everyone cheered. Now they're facing consequences, and I'm the one watching. The difference is I earned my position. I built something. I succeeded. I did it all while they were calling me a failure. They had 13 years to treat me with basic respect. They chose cruelty every single time. So now they get to live with what cruelty costs, when the person you're cruel to has more power than you realized. That dinner was the last time they'll ever have the opportunity to make me feel small. And this was the first time they understood what I'm actually capable of when I stopped playing the role they assigned me. I haven't forgiven them. I won't forgive them. And I don't care if that makes me the villain in their version of this story. I was always the villain anyway. Now at least I'm the villain who won.